I want students and private pilots and commercial pilots and any pilot to understand is, why do you need to know what I'm talking about? So I could sit here and I could lecture if I knew anything about aircraft design. I could spend hours droning on about why aircraft are designed the way they are. And none of that may help you actually fly an airplane or keep you safe and make sure that you are safely flying an airplane. But what I want is for you, when you think about performance of aerodynamics, is think about why is it that I'm getting taught this? What is it about this that I need to understand? So we're going to talk about some very basic concepts, but I want to make sure that you understand why it is that we go through and spend the time and talk about it. Because what I have noticed is when we get to the project and it's time for a check-off, a lot of students who are misunderstanding some of the very basic concepts of performance. So let's just start with the very basics at the beginning, just as a review. So why does an airplane fly? So an airplane flies because of lift, okay? Not because of an engine. It flies because of lift. And lift is provided by an airfoil. If you're flying an airplane, that airfoil is, for the most part, your wings. If you're flying a helicopter, that airfoil is your rotor blades and other aircraft, other ways of providing lift. But for us, it's our wings. So you should remember the two people who are really important for lift are Bernoulli and Newton. So Bernoulli talks about fluid dynamics and says that when fluid flows through, when it accelerates, it creates lower air pressure. So we have our aircraft here, and this is our airfoil. When air comes over this, the airfoil is designed so that the air on the top is accelerated, the air on the bottom is not accelerated. So that means that there's an area of low pressure on top of the wing, and that, since high pressure goes to low pressure, the pressure gives us lift. That's a very basic explanation of Bernoulli. So that's why an airfoil is designed the way it is. The other one that matters is Newton. And Newton, one of his three basic laws is that for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. So if we have an aircraft that has a wing that is, this is exaggerated, but is tilted up, and air is flowing and hits the wing, when it hits the wing, it deflects downwards. That causes lift with the air that deflects upwards, the opposite reaction. So those are two things that cause lift in an aircraft. Now, lift acts perpendicular to the broad line of the wing. So I don't have a pen with me. I do. It's really nice to have a pen to demonstrate this. And believe it or not, I don't have one. Okay. Oh, maybe my computer. I'll explain that. Okay, so if lift is actually acting this way to the wing. Now, that's the basics of lift. Why did I mention that? Because I want to talk about turning. Do we understand how a plane really turns? So one of the problems that we have in a Cessna 172 is that you have a yoke. And a yoke looks a lot like a steering wheel to most people. In fact, it's supposed to, because that's why they designed it, to make people more comfortable in airplanes after World War II. They replaced sticks and they made them with yokes. So people think about a car and they say, well, I turn my car, my steering wheel, my car turns. And then when I'm done turning, I turn it back and the car stops turning. And I see an unbelievable number of private pilots and student pilots who think that's the way an airplane turns. And it's not true. We do not have a nose wheel that's turning in the air, turning the airplane. When we, nice laughing in the background, you're supposed to be on mute. Anyway, when we bank an aircraft, when we use the stick and turn it to the left, or we move the yoke to the left, the ailerons move, as we know, and it starts the aircraft banking. Okay. Now, if you leave the yoke turned to the left, what's going to happen? The aircraft is just going to continue banking and will not stop. And if you're not flying an aerobatic plane, it will end up looking like this, which would not be very good. Okay. So while we keep the yoke turned, the aircraft continues to bank. If we keep the yoke turned a little bit, it will bank very gradually. If you turn it a lot, it banks at a higher roll rate. The amount that you turn the yoke is not necessarily the angle that you're going to end up being. It just shows you how fast you're going to get there. So once you find the bank angle that you want, you have to move the yoke back to the center. And believe it or not, a lot of student pilots don't recognize that they're doing that while they're flying. Well, they don't understand it. But if you don't move the yoke back to the center or the stick back to the center, the plane keeps on banking. Why is that true? Okay, I don't know if you can see this little string here or not, but this is where lift is acting in the plane. Okay, and when we bank the aircraft, now the lift is acting diagonally to the ground, but still perpendicularly to the plane like this. And lift has two components. And we're going to use my soda bottle here to explain this so you can see this easier. Okay, this is not a Pepsi ad, sorry about that. Now, the Pepsi bottle is one bottle length high. And when we're in straight level flight, this is the amount of lift that we have. When we bank the aircraft, and let's go ahead and put a nice big bank in here of like 45 degrees, how much of the lift now is going up? And we could measure that. This is the amount the lift is going up to here. It's about this amount. And if I roll this back upright, you can see it only goes up about halfway up the Pepsi bottle. If I go to, hopefully the Pepsi bottle is closed. If I go to 90 degrees, how much lift is acting upwards now? Oh, actually none. That would not be a good, safe place to be in a Cessna 172. But even look at 70 degrees here, the amount of lift acting upward is like this tiny little bit of amount. So as we bank an aircraft, we lose a lot of the vertical component of lift. That is the reason why when we bank airplanes that we need to add back pressure. It's that loss of lift. This is why we teach you horizontal component of lift and vertical component of lift. So that you recognize when you're banking an aircraft that you need to add back pressure. And the more you bank it, the more you lose the vertical component of lift, the more back pressure you need. Now, in addition, the more you bank the aircraft, you can see the more to the side the bottle is pointing, that's more horizontal component of lift. That's what's pulling the aircraft across the sky. That's a horizontal component of lift. That's what makes an aircraft turn. Now, once we're in a nice, stable bank, the plane will just turn nicely across the sky. So that explains what we're doing with our ailerons, and it explains what we're doing with our elevator and why we're doing it. Now, the other thing that we have going on is we have rudder usage. And this is a concept that a lot of people have a lot of trouble with. Now, let's talk about the ball in the aircraft, what we call officially called the inclinometer. So under your turn coordinator, which doesn't work in a lot of the aircraft, the inclinometer still works, the ball works. The ball is just telling you, it's just a ball suspended in liquid. It's telling you what's happening with centrifugal force. So if you were in your car and you weren't staying home and self-isolating, and you turned really quickly around a corner, let's say we turned left around a corner, which way does your body go? Well, maybe you don't think about it, but when you turn left, your body goes out to the right. It goes to the outside of the turn. So a lot of people, when they turn their cars, they lean into the turn to counteract the effect of the car pushing them outside the turn. So that's what happens when we turn our car. So if we had a little inclinometer in our car, and you can put one on your dashboard or put one on your cell phone and have it going. When you turn left, you will see the ball go out to the right. And that's just showing you what's happening. It's kind of like a centrifuge. If you turn the centrifuge, everything goes out away from the direction you're turning. Now, in an airplane, now let's go back for a second. Let's say you take your car out to a racetrack that's curved. And when you go and you turn, the car is banked as well as turning. In that car, and this is the reason why we have banked turns, so if you play with one of those race sets when you were a kid that has a nice banked turn on it, those cars don't go flying off the track because the curve helps keep centrifugal force pushing down against the road. So theoretically, if we bank an aircraft and just leave it like this, the ball would stay in the center and we wouldn't have to worry at all about using the rudders. And in a car on a curved track, that's essentially what's happening. They don't need any rudders because there's no centrifugal force at that point if the bank is just correct. Now, what's happening in an airplane? Why is the ball moving and where it's moving? So we said that in a car, when we turn to the left, the ball goes to the right. Now, hopefully you all remember when you've been in a plane that if you turn to the left, the ball goes to the left. So does that mean that when we're flying an airplane, the laws of physics don't work? Well, obviously not. Something else must be going on that's causing that ball to go inside the turn. And it has very little to do with the fact of the bank. So what's happening is something called adverse yaw. And sometimes you people have heard of that, but a lot of times people just read it in a book and don't understand it and don't understand why is it important. It's important to know how to control the plane. So when we bank the aircraft, the wind is going faster over the upper wing than it is going over the lower wing because the upper wing is moving faster into the wind. In addition, when we turn the aircraft to the left in this case, the left aileron is up and the right aileron is down. So the right aileron is kind of acting like a flap. It's increasing the surface area of the wing and it's adding more lift. So this wing is coming up. This wing is doing the opposite of that. It's having less lift. Now, there's another concept that we need to talk about the generation of lift, and that's drag. So you probably vaguely read somewhere about different types of drag, and this is actually a pretty important concept. The kind of drag that we understand intuitively is parasite drag. So if we're riding our bicycle, say, and we put our hands out to the sides, what happens to the speed of the bicycle? It slows down. It's why bicycle riders, when they ride, they keep their bodies in because they want to have very aerodynamic. They don't want to slow the bicycle down. So that's what we do when we ride a bicycle. That's because the faster you go, the more drag you create. If you're bicycling very, very slowly, you don't notice the difference in speed. But when you're bicycling very, very fast, those minor things sticking out from the bicycle are going to add a lot of drag. So bicycles that are meant to go fast are very aerodynamic looking. The helmets are very aerodynamic. The rider tries to stay very aerodynamic. So those are things that slow us down. It's called parasite drag. But there's another type of drag that's called induced drag. Induced drag is the drag that's created because of the creation of lift in an airplane. So when we have a wing that's creating lift, there's a little friction that's going on between the air flowing over the wing and the airplane, and that's causing some drag. And the more lift that we have, the more induced drag that we have. So that's what induced drag is. It has to do with the creation of lift. Now, if we pitch up an aircraft, we know that the aircraft tends to want to go up because it has more lift. So as we pitch up, we slow down, we create more lift, but we also create more drag because of induced drag. So the total drag of any aircraft is equal to the parasite drag plus the induced drag, blah, blah, blah. We don't really care about that right now. We're not going to that. What I want to go back to is what happens in this aircraft that's entering a bank and this upper wing is moving faster than this lower wing. If it's moving faster and it's creating more lift, then it's also creating more drag. What happens if an airplane has more drag on one side than the other? Well, this is one of the things we learn in multi-engine planes, but what happens is the plane gets yawed towards the side with the drag. So this wing wants to drag back and this wing wants to move forward. So what happens when we are entering a bank angle, when we're entering a bank angle is that this wing wants to get pulled back towards the higher wing. So if you look at that, if we're turning to the left, adverse yaw means the nose is moving to the right. So that's what adverse yaw is. Now this only occurs when we're entering the bank. Once the bank is steady, both of the wings have the same speed of airflow over them, and we don't really have any difference in drag, and we don't have this adverse yaw. So the key point here, why I spent so much time on this, is when you enter a turn to the left, what happens is the nose goes to the right, and you should be able to see this. Next time you go up flying, whenever that will be, I want you to bank the aircraft without using any rudder, and do it fairly quickly. And you'll look out in the distance, and when you look into the distance, you'll see the nose goes like that. Adverse yaw is the plane is turning, yawing opposite the direction of the bank. Now that's an uncoordinated situation. It's very uncomfortable, it's very inefficient, and it's unsafe. So we don't want you to do that. So that's why when you're entering in the turn, as the nose is going off in one direction, you're adding rudder to keep the nose in the same spot. So the way a bank should look like when you enter it should be just like this. The nose stays perfectly straight ahead while you're banking. And you don't need the ball to see that. I know everyone kind of looks at the ball because it helps a lot, but you could just look straight ahead of you, and as you're banking, add rudder as necessary to keep the nose in the same spot. Once you reach the bank angle you want and you put the yoke or the stick back to neutral, you shouldn't need much rudder of any anymore if the plane is nicely balanced. The plane will be facing straight ahead, and then it'll just pull itself across the sky. That's the correct way to enter a turn. There shouldn't be a lot of rudder use in the middle of the turn once it's steady. Now, if the wings are rocking back and forth, you keep on changing bank angle, yeah, we're going to need a little bit of rudder. But for the most part, the plane should be nice and stable. You won't need rudder again until you roll back out, because as you roll back out, now the lower wing is moving faster than the upper wing. There's more drag going on there, and now as you're rolling to the right, the nose wants to go to the left. So as you roll out, you're to the right, you add right rudder. So a proper turn, and believe it or not, most students are not making proper turns, is you start banking. You don't need a lot of back pressure when you start the bank, right? Why? Because we don't have a lot of loss of that lift yet. So when we start the bank, very little back pressure, but we need rudder. We keep on adding rudder as we go into the bank, and as we add more bank, then we start adding more and more back pressure. Once we're at the bank angle we want, we hold the same back pressure throughout the maneuver, and then we keep it nice and steady until we get to the time to roll out, where we turn back to the right, add right rudder, and then as the aircraft goes back level, we start adding the forward pressure to stop the turn. That's the proper way to turn an aircraft. That's why we teach you horizontal component of lift, vertical component of lift, adverse yaw, induced drag. All those concepts are really important to understand how the proper way to actually turn the aircraft is. So that's turns. Okay, unless there's any questions about that, I'm going to move forward to another topic in aerodynamics. Okay, next, I want to talk about stalls. So if you follow aviation press at all, you'll know that the #1 cause of fatalities is loss of control accidents. So there is a disconnect between what students are learning and the way they're flying that is leading to have these loss of control accidents. So it's really important that we understand exactly what's going on in an aircraft and why it stalls and why people are surprised oftentimes when they get themselves into a stall situation. So I'm going to start with just the basic definitions at first. The first is angle of attack. So by definition, the angle of attack is the angle between the chord line of the wing and the relative wind. Okay, so yeah, a lot of words, blah, blah. This is our wing, okay? We could see if we look at it head on like this, that this is the chord line. It's just kind of like the profile of the wing if you want to look at that. In an aircraft in straight level flight, if you look at this airplane, even this little, model, this is level flight. The wing has a slight angle to it relative to the longitudinal axis of the aircraft. That creates a little tiny bit of an angle that you can see right over there. That angle happens to be called the angle of incidence. It's not really super important, but the fact of the matter is there's always a little angle, even in straight and level flight, between the wing and the flight path of the plane when we're going straight and level. So that helps us with our Newton and helps our Bernoulli. Now, you have to imagine so the relative wind definition is, it's a really simple definition, is opposite the flight path of the aircraft. So if this aircraft is going straight up like this, the relative wind is straight down. If the aircraft is straight and level, then the relative wind is level. If the aircraft is descending, then the relative wind is down like this. So you can tell what the relative wind is just by looking at the airplane. You have to know what the flight path is. For example, when we do slow flight, the plane is kind of nose up like this, but our flight path is like this. Let's put it over here. And you can see that creates a pretty good angle there. Like, whatever that angle is, that's the flight path. And that's the way most students come to think of angle of attack. They think of it as sort of like the horizon or level flight relative to the attitude of the wings. But that's very incorrect because it's only true when we're going straight and level. And believe it or not, very few people stall aircraft when they're going straight and level. So you have to think about visually, what is the flight path of the aircraft? So a very difficult time, for example, so when we're coming into land, do we come into land like this? Are we like pointing the plane down towards the ground? No, we're not. Actually, when we come into land, the plane's almost level. It's got a little down to it, but for the most part, it's kind of level. We're using power to help the plane descend, not stick the nose down and pick up airspeed. So when we're coming into land, our angle of attack is already relatively high, even though we're going down. And that's something that's sort of not intuitive to a lot of pilots. So this is something that I see a lot of people come and do. So let's say we're landing on runway 28 out there, runway 28, and you come up to the building. So we're coming to the building, and you feel a little bit of sink as you're coming towards the building. What's the typical reaction of a student or a private pilot or someone who hasn't really been trained properly when they start sinking towards a building on final approach or towards trees or towards power lines? The typical response is to pull up. This, from your first flight, pull up, go up, right? Pull up, go up, push down, go down. But that's not the correct response because we're already having a relatively high angle of attack. If the first thing you do is pull up, let's put it over here, most likely what's going to happen next is the aircraft is going to stall. The other thing that may just happen is we could be in that area of reverse command that we talk about. So when we do slow flight, and again, this is why we teach you slow flight. Why do we teach slow flight? Because when we go really slow, the more we pitch up, the more drag we create, and instead of going up, the aircraft starts to go down. So when you're coming in on final approach at a slow airspeed and you pitch up, if you're below a certain speed, the aircraft will just go down faster instead of going up. In fact, at those airspeeds, it's better to pitch down because we get more airflow over the wings and you'd actually climb by pitching down. So that's why when you're on final, you shouldn't use pitch to change altitude. You should use power, especially if you're near an obstacle. In actuality, you should use both, but that's another story. But if you just pitch without power, then you're going to put yourself up in a situation where you could mush into the obstacle, and you don't want that. So that's one of the things that's really important to understand about angle of attack. Now, so an aircraft stalls when it reaches the critical angle of attack. That critical angle of attack is a constant. The angle is, say, 17.5 degrees or something in the Cessna 172. It's actually not that big. It's a function of wing design. So as long as you still have the same wing on your aircraft, the angle of attack that it's going to stall out is always going to be the same. This is like one of the favorite questions on the written test of the FAA. What angle of attack does an airplane stall at? It's always the same. It doesn't make a difference what speed you're going at. It doesn't make a difference, how much the plane weighs. It doesn't make a difference if you're turning, climbing, or descending. It always stalls at the same angle of attack. So that's one of those famous questions. The thing that changes a lot is what speed an aircraft stalls at. So please don't confuse those two concepts. The angle is always the same, just the speed that we get to that angle changes. And that's why we talk about the various factors there. So critical angle of attack is when an aircraft stalls. So will this aircraft stall? I say to people on a check ride, mock check ride, is this aircraft in danger of stalling? And everyone's like, oh yeah, that's a very high angle of attack. And that's a 100% incorrect answer. All you could say to me is that the pitch attitude of the aircraft right now is very high. We don't know anything about angle of attack unless we know the flight path of the aircraft. If we could imagine that this was a F-16 and it pulled up to vertical flight, is an F-16 in danger of stalling in a vertical flight? And the answer is no. Why? Not because it has partly because it has really big engines, but it has to do with the angle of attack. The plane is going straight up because it has lots of excess thrust. What's the angle of attack? It's almost nothing. That plane is not in danger of stalling. If you take your 172, your DA-40, and you go out of the practice area and you pull up to vertical flight, are you in danger of stalling? Hell yeah. Why? Because we don't have a lot of excess thrust. And in about half a second, the plane's going to lose all the speed that it's stored up. And it's going to stop going straight up, which it does for like a half a second. And flight path is going to start going like that. As the flight path starts going like that, we stall. Now, can this aircraft stall? Can an aircraft going straight down stall? Most people are like, no, it can't. But actually it can, because again, it just depends on what is the flight path of the aircraft. Now, if you take a plane and you put it in a loop, and then right around here, you pull really hard back down to this point, the plane is still moving this way because it hasn't caught up yet with how you move the nose. So while the plane is still moving that way, it has a really large angle of attack. And it starts to shake, and then it starts to fall, and then the flight path starts going this way again, and it regains flying. So the point is an aircraft could stall at any attitude, or at any attitude it might not stall, depending on what the flight path of the aircraft is. So that's the thing that catches people sort of by surprise, is that attitude that it stalls in is sometimes not an attitude that we think about it. So a lot of the stalls that are occurring in pilots are in attitudes that don't feel excessive to them. Why? If you were going down and then you pull up very suddenly, let's say this attitude, this doesn't look like an aircraft that's about to stall. But if the aircraft is still going down because it doesn't have any power in, for example, then that aircraft can stall. Okay, so that is the situation with stalls. So the place that we're most in danger of stalling is go-arounds or on the climb out. So if you go ahead and you're coming into land and then Ken drives onto the runway because he wants to show off how fast this Tesla can go, then you're going to have to do a go-around. The first thing you should do on a go-around in any aircraft is full power, okay? The first thing that I see most people do on a go-around is pitch up, okay? That's the wrong thing to do because the aircraft is still sinking, you're pitching up, you're creating a high angle attack. It's a very dangerous place to be. The second thing that I do see students and private pilots, and actually a lot of commercial pilots as well, the first thing they want to do if they don't pull up is make a radio call. 3-1 Mike going around, 2 Papa Juliet going around. Okay. Meanwhile, the plane is still sinking towards the ground and is heading towards the thing that they want to get away from. Okay. Communication is not the first thing to do. Remember, aviate, communicate, navigate. Fly the plane first. Unless your pulling up is going to hit someone right above you, there's no reason to have to say anything right away. So fly the plane first. Make sure it's in control before you worry about making your radio call. Full power. Okay. Let the plane accelerate. Gradually pitch up so that the flight path of the aircraft can keep up with the pitch angle that you're pitching up to so that we don't have a high angle. So that's why we teach you to do the go around the way we do it. Full power, flaps 20, nose on the horizon gently. Then you make your radio call and then get the rest of the flaps out a little bit of time. Okay. There was someone threw out a quick question about a symmetrical wing. We're not going to talk about that because that's a little bit too advanced for this topic today. The last thing I want to talk about in this aerodynamics section is spins. So what is a spin? So, I mean, we talk about it. We tell you like spin recovery technique, blah, blah, blah. Hopefully you'll know what pair is. So anyway, but that's for your instructor to be teaching. I just want to make sure you understand what's going on in the spin. So a spin is an uncoordinated stall. Okay, it's a stall while the aircraft is yawing. That's basically what uncoordinated means. Whenever the aircraft yaws, it's uncoordinated. We don't really like yaw in flight. If we could not yaw anytime except for doing landings, that would be really wonderful. So if we go ahead and a plane stalls and it's rotating at the same time, it's yawing at the same time, when it stalls, one wing is going to be moving faster than the other. If one wing is moving faster than the other, one wing is going to be more deeply stalled than the other. So what that does is that rotation that's been going on while you were flying, once you're not flying anymore, it continues and accelerates. And the plane rotates while it's descending. Okay, it's yawing while it's descending. And that can happen fairly quickly when you get into a spin. And that's basically all a spin really is, that the aircraft was yawing while you enter the stall. So if we never, ever, ever fly uncoordinated, if we're the perfect pilot using our rudders, we can never, ever, ever spin. If we never, ever, ever stall an aircraft, then we can never spin an aircraft, okay? A spin, by definition, has to be a yawing, uncoordinated stall. Okay, so that's basically what a spin is. This concept of one wing being more stalled than another is one that sometimes is a little confusing, and I don't really want to go too much into the aerodynamics of it, but I just want to let you know that an aircraft wing does not stall the same time all across the wing. And you could get up one of those little YouTube videos where they have the little strings on the wing, and they could see when it enters a stall that, you know, at first it starts stalling back here, then it moves forward, 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 and it moves out and stuff like that. So you can see the way the stall progresses on the wing. So some parts of a wing can be stalled and other parts can't be. So one wing can have more stalling than the other wings, but they're both going to be stalled. That's it for spins that I just want to mention. So those are the really, for me, for aerodynamics, those are the basic things that I need you to know. I need you to understand how a plane turns. I need to understand why we pitch up and why we use rudder in a turn. I need you to really understand why a plane stalls, why it's dangerous and say a go around, why we have a power on stall if, let's say, we're turning, and why an aircraft spins. The only other thing that is really important to discuss is load factor. And that's the last thing, and then we could be done. So I just want to do this one really quickly. So we talk about the airspeed that an airplane stalls at. So a Cessna 172R stalls at 33 knots in landing configuration. That's in specified conditions. That's straight level, unaccelerated flight, at sea level on a standard day, at maximum gross weight, blah, 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 blah. If you change any of those conditions, then the stalling speed is not 33 anymore. So it's not a limitation of the aircraft, it's just sort of an informational piece of a number that you should be speed that you should know. So the actual speed that it stalls at is going to vary depending on flight conditions. There's one factor and one factor only that greatly changes the speed that we stall at, and that is load factor. Load factor is not exactly, but pretty much just another name for G factors, okay, the G forces. So if you remember from like third grade science, the difference between weight and mass. So I have a certain mass to my body, which is bigger than it should be. And there's one G force pushing on me right now, and that mass makes my weight, say, 195 pounds. If I go to the moon, which has 1/6 of our gravity, then it's going to be 60 whatever pounds, okay, 67 whatever, it's not okay. So that would be my weight on the moon. I still have the same mass, but I weigh less because gravity is different. If I go to Jupiter, that has like, whatever it is, I have no idea, 20 times the gravitational pull of the Earth, is probably more, then I'm going to, instead of weighing like, say, it's 200 pounds, I'm going to weigh 4,000 pounds. Okay, that's the difference between mass and weight. It has to do with the gravitational force. Now, when we're flying, we pull G's. Okay, if we pull really hard on the stick to go into a straight up flight of F-16, we pull a lot of G's. And if you fly one of those planes, you'll see there's a little G meter to let you know what kind of G's you're pulling. And you feel that. You feel the pressure pushing down on your body. You feel that in your car when you're at a red light and you jam on the accelerator to get past the cop who's right there, right? Because he's not going to give you a ticket because of the COVID virus, right? That's what everyone's doing these days. So you feel pushback in your seat, that's a G force. So anytime you feel G's in an aircraft, you're increasing the weight of the aircraft plane. So if we pull 3 G's, that means that your aircraft that before used to weigh 2,500 pounds now actually weighs 7,500 pounds. And that's not a made-up thing. It's really true. I mean, the weight of the aircraft has increased because the G forces on the aircraft has increased. Now, if you remember, if we have any amount of weight of the aircraft, for it to maintain level flight, we need to have that amount of lift going the other direction. Excuse me, sorry. So anytime we pull G's, we need to have an increase of lift to overcome the G forces that are going on that are increasing the weight of the aircraft. That's called load factor. Load factor and G force is pretty much the same thing for us. So when do we pull a lot of G's? Well, we pull a lot of G's if we're going to do a go-around, right? Oh, man, I don't want to hit Ken's Tesla. That'd be a big insurance claim. So you pull up really hard. If you pull up really hard, you've increased the G forces. So the weight's increased a lot. First, at that point, the speed that we're going to stall at is going to be much higher than it was if we were in straight level flight. If we bank an aircraft, if we go ahead and put the aircraft in a 60-degree bank, do we need back pressure to keep the nose up? Yeah, we do. When we pull that back pressure, we're going to feel that pushing us down in our seat. That's G forces. That's increasing the stalling speed that we stall at. That's the relationship between stalling speed and load factor. If you go into a bank turn, but you don't hold the nose up, if you let it drop down, does the stalling speed still increase? No. In fact, if you let it drop down to a 0G maneuver, there's no stalling speed. But if you just let the nose drop and you keep it nice at 1G, the stalling speed remains the same. So the stalling speed only increases when we bank an aircraft if it's a level bank. And that's the idea about load factor. Does anyone have any questions about aerodynamics before I move forward? You could chat or type up. Anything? Hopefully you guys are following along. Okay, let's move forward to the next question. So we're going to talk a little bit about weight and balance. Okay, so we need a few terms to talk about weight and balance so that we make sure that we're all on the same page. The aircraft has what's called the center of gravity. The center of gravity is the place where the aircraft would pivot on, where its weight would be equally balanced laterally and forward and backward, forward and aft. So think of like a swing, what's that called? Teeter-totter, where it would be balanced. In aircraft, most of the weight is to the front of the aircraft, not towards the rear. The rear doesn't have that much. The center of gravity of most aircraft, of all aircraft I know, is somewhere near the front of the aircraft, somewhere, usually right around where the pilots, behind where the pilots and co-pilots sitting. But there's a range, obviously. So we could calculate that center of gravity. And the center of gravity is expressed in inches from a certain location in the aircraft. And that location that we measure from is called the datum plane. It's just a word, it's just where do we measure from. In a dime DA-40, they measure from the front of the spinner, which kind of makes sense. They measure from the front of the aircraft and they go backwards, so all the numbers are positive. In a Cessna 172, for whatever reason, Cessna decided to make their datum plane the firewall of the aircraft. So they start counting from the firewall back. That means that anything in front of the firewall has a negative number. It's just a little bit more confusing, but it's the same thing. So any location in the aircraft can have a location of inches away from the datum plane. So if our pilot's sitting over here, he's this far away from the datum plane, which may be like 25 inches. The passengers back here, they may be sitting 60 inches or something like that away from the datum plane. The baggage compartment could be 70 inches away. Whatever it is, it's going to be in the POH. And that distance that you're away from the datum plane is called the arm. Arm is just distance from the datum plane. So we could describe any location in the aircraft where a weight is by its distance from the datum plane. To calculate your center of gravity, what you're going to do is you're going to take each arm and multiply by the weight that's at that arm. So if I'm the only pilot in the passenger side, in the pilot side, in the front of the aircraft, maybe it's 20 inches. I weigh, let's make it, 200 pounds. It's 20 times 200, and you get a new number. 20 times 200 is 4,000. That's 4,000 pound inches. Who cares? Doesn't matter. It's just 4,000. That number is called the moment. It's a meaningless number as far as conceptualization is. It's just the arm, the location of the aircraft where the weight is, times the distance from the datum plane. So we can add up all these numbers, all these moments. And if we add up all the moments and add up all the weights, we get the center of gravity of the plane, and we could check the weight of the aircraft to make sure it's okay. So that's really the easiest way to do it, is just take each location, figure out what the weight is at that location, what's it on, multiply those two numbers together, get the moment, add up all the moments, and add up all the weights. The moment divided by weight gives you center of gravity. That's really all it is to it. The other terms you need to know are the maximum takeoff weight or maximum gross weight of the aircraft, and you don't want to exceed that. The basic empty weight is the weight of the aircraft with no fuel, passengers, or baggage, and that's going to be in your POH, and we'll get the weight and the arm or the moment for those from your POH. And that's pretty much it, unless you have any questions about center of gravity or weight and balance. They're very, very simple questions for the most part, as long as you understand the basic concept. Okay. That's all I have on that, unless anyone has any questions or feedback. Okay. Next, I have a question here to talk about airspace. Okay. Airspace. So, unfortunately, I wish I could draw this. I don't know if there's a way to draw this program. I don't know. Okay, so airspace, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Okay, there's airspaces A through G, except for F. F doesn't exist because that's only in Europe. So we only have to worry about A, B, C, D, E, G. So I normally like to draw this on the whiteboard, but I can't do it today, so we'll just kind of talk it through. If we start out and we think about the world as it existed before the FAA, and yeah, someone's saying maybe I could use Microsoft Paint, but that'd be too much trouble. Anyway, so the world as it existed before the FAA, all airspace was class Gulf. Okay, it's kind of like the Wild West. It's unregulated. You can pretty much do whatever you want. So, you know, if Benjamin Franklin wanted to fly his kite in the airspace, he was able to do that. If the French wanted to fly their gliders in airspace, they could do that. Wright brothers, they could do whatever they want. And then after the Wright brothers, the FAA was invented, and then the FAA came up with airspace. And they said, everything can't be class Gulf anymore. So class Gulf was the uncontrolled airspace. Everything the FAA made after that date is something called controlled airspace. So once we start adding airspaces, they're always controlled airspaces in one way or the other. So the first thing they did is just they said, okay, you guys could have the airspace from 1,200 feet down to the earth and do whatever you want there, we don't care. Everything above 1,200 feet or 700 feet, depending on where you live, we're going to call that controlled airspace and we're going to regulate it. That's class Echo. Class Echo is just generic controlled airspace. From the point of view of a private pilot who's flying VFR, the difference between class Gulf and class Echo is very minuscule. The only thing that changes there is the visibility and cloud clearance rules. Other than that, for you, it really doesn't make a difference whether you're in class Gulf or class Echo. But from the FAA's point of view, they just want to tell you, hey, the rules are a little bit different. In Gulf, 700 feet towards the ground or 1,200 feet where you are, it's 1 mile clear of clouds. You go to Echo, now it's 3 miles, and you'd stay 500 feet below, 1,000 feet above, or 2,000 vertical from clouds. That's the big difference when you go from Gulf to Echo. And that's the first change. The next thing was they said, hey, now we want towered airports. So they created towered airports. And towered airports are another type of controlled airspace, and that's class Delta. So surrounding any aircraft, any airport with an operating control tower, for the most part, there are a couple exceptions, but for the most part, it's class Delta. And it's just in that airspace surrounding the Delta. So from the surface to usually around 2,500 feet AGL, approximately 4 mile radius from the airport is going to be class Delta. And it's plunked down in the middle of that class Gulf. So all around it's going to be Gulf, and all above it's going to be, above 2,500 AGL, it's going to be Echo. And then they said, hey, now we're going to have bigger airports where we're going to have a lot more commercials. So we call that class Charlie. And that's airports like, Allentown or Islip or airports like that. So they have commercial service. They're busier. They have approach control radar. And now we have those little airspaces with the shelf area, the inner area, and they have flight following and all that stuff going on. That's class Charlie. Same cloud clearance requirements as class Delta and class Echo. It's all the same. And then finally, they got really big airports with 747s and stuff for landing. And then that's class Bravo. So the big difference about class Bravo is now we need a clearance to enter. It's a little bit different. And then we need a ADS-B and Mode C transponders there. And now we don't worry about cloud clearance anymore, just clear clouds, but it's still 3 miles visibility. And that's the basics of airspace. If you remember that much, then that's pretty much the basics that you need to know. Okay, next. So the next question is about flight following. Okay, it's from Armando. So is it mandatory to request flight following? So the generic answer is absolutely not. It's not mandatory. Flight following is a completely voluntary service as far as the FAA is concerned. As a student pilot, when you're doing a cross country and you're a student pilot solo cross country, we do require or strongly suggest that you use flight following on every flight. I want all the students here to use flight following on all your solo cross countries. There's no reason not to. Now, the confusion that happened in this particular instance that Amanda's talking about was leaving an airport like Reading, and they asked them about flight following. So if you're leaving an airport that provides radar services, then they can give you flight following right away when you take off. So Reading is a class Delta, but it's called a Super Delta. Kind of a stupid name, but that's what it is, because it's a Delta airport that has radar services as well. So it's kind of like a Class Charlie, but it's not a Class Charlie because you don't need a Mode C transponder and ADS-B, and it's only like that little radius, but they have approach control radar. So when you leave Reading, they are going to ask you whether or not you want to have flight following, so they know whether or not to give you a code, and then after you depart, the tower would hand you off to the radar controller, the departure controller. So we would ask that when you're going to Reading, say yes to flight following, but you don't have to do it. If you don't take it, Reading doesn't care. If you're going to Allentown, say, or capital cities, the one next to that, Harrisburg, for example, those are Class Charlies. If you land at a Class Charlie, when you take off, flight following is not optional because you're already in the Charlie. They're not going to. They have to give you radar services legally because you're already in a Charlie. So when you're in a Charlie, they don't ask you, do you want flight following or not? They just give you a squawk code. If you guys, any of you went to Atlantic City, you'll just get a squawk code when you land at Atlantic City. But in Reading, it's optional. If you go into a Tersa, like Harrisburg or Wilkes-Barre Scranton, again, that's another situation where they have approach control radar, and they can give you flight following as soon as you depart, and that's going to be optional up to you or not. And of course, there's no reason to say no. I don't know why anyone would refuse the service. It's a good service, and it helps you out. But that's why they do it. There's a follow-up question here from Umar. What is flight following? Okay, so when we're going cross-country, we're navigating from one airport to another. We could do it the old-fashioned way, and we could, if we're in just echo airspace, we don't have to talk to anybody. We don't have to use any navigation aids. We could just sit there with our little map and our plotter, and we could fly along and look at the landmarks. We don't have to talk to anybody. We look out the window, look at the aircraft, and make sure we don't hit anybody, make sure we get to our destination. Our destination is another non-towered airport like Princeton. We could just go ahead and land, and we wouldn't have talked to anyone in the entire flight. So that's perfectly legal. But what happens if you're flying along and you get lost? Well, now you're on your own. Now you got to figure out where you are. You got to, find your way back. What happens if you're flying along and there's a bunch of gliders in the air and you don't see them? And then it'd be nice to know that maybe there's a bunch of gliders around. Well, maybe that a 747 just took off below you and is climbing into you. It'd be nice to have someone to help you out there. Or if there's an emergency and you have lost your engine and you need to land at an airport, it'd be nice if a controller could just tell you, hey, there's an airport at 12 o'clock, 2 miles, once you land there. So that's why flight following was invented. Flight following is a service of controllers who have radar who could follow you along on your flight, and time permitting could give you some help. They'll call out traffic for you. They'll call out if you're in danger of running into a mountain, for example, obstruction clearance they can help you out with. If there's weather, they can mention to you that there's hey, there's a level 3 rainstorm ahead of you. It could be a thunderstorm. Maybe you want to avoid that, stuff like that. So that's what flight following is. It's an optional service that allows you to have ATC help you along on your cross-country trips. So once you get to the cross-country phase, you will, if you haven't used it yet and you're in cross-country phase, then you should tell me after this and I should talk to your flight instructor. But otherwise, when you get there, you'll learn that when you get to the cross-country phase. That's flight following. Now, if you're flying through Class Charlie or Class Bravo airspace, it's not optional. You have to talk to the controllers in that case. In that case, they will call out traffic and stuff like that. One last thing I want to point out to you about these services, they're time permitting. The job of approach controllers is to keep IFR traffic away from each other. Anything that has to do with VFR traffic is kind of if they have the time to do it. So if you go flying today, for example, there's nobody in the sky. The controllers have tons of time and they're very helpful. But if you go flying, at 8 in the morning when things are back to normal and try to talk to Newark, they're like way too busy with the rush hour to like deal with you. So it's just a time permitting service. And then sometimes even if they're talking to you, they may not give you all the advisories they would if they're busy controlling other aircraft. But that's what flight following is. So that is flight following and airspace. Let's see, does anyone have any other questions they want to go through? Because I have been talking for an hour and you may be bored with me at this point. Let's see, did I miss anything here? Okay, so I'm just gonna kind of concluding box here. My basic, just, again, sort of some of the people missed you at the beginning. I'm Jeff Slutsky. I'm the chief pilot at Princeton Flying School. My major job is to make sure that the flight instructors here are teaching you properly how to learn how to fly. I'm the one who came up with the syllabus, and I make sure people follow it and, fly with all the instructors and make sure they know what they're doing. And I think that most folks should be doing a pretty good job from what I see. If you have any problems with your flight instructor ever, you feel like there's some issue with the way they're teaching, you feel they're not doing what you want, always available to discuss those issues with you. If something comes up that you're having some trouble a particular topic, I'm around as well. Most of you are probably not going to fly with me, mainly because I don't fly 172s anymore unless it's a prog check or a CFI. And I'm fairly expensive as well because I'm doing this as a career, so I have to get paid a little bit more. But I'm certainly available to sit down and talk with you if you have any problems. When you see me sitting at my desk, or if you see me sitting in this office now, feel free to seek me out. And certainly once you get your private, if you want to transition to one of the diamonds or get twin training or fly one of the Cirrus, learn advanced avionics and stuff like that, instrument rating, I'd be around for that. But that's pretty much why I'm here. Please send some feedback back at the end of this call via email to the front desk. If you liked it, if you didn't like it, if there are things you wish we changed, if there's enough positive enthusiasm, we could do this on a more regular basis. It really helps if you guys have questions. Otherwise, I just sit here and kind of talk about the things I want to talk about, which may not be what you need to know. Someone just said one last question, so let's see what that is, and I'll let you go. Okay. Armando, are you going to ask your last question? Okay. Is 40's FA practice test okay? So someone actually asked me about this at the beginning. So some of you are getting ready for your written exams. So I'll just repeat this again because it bears repeating. How are you supposed to be getting ready for your written exam, and what does that look like? Everyone who's enrolled in the private pilot training program here has gotten some sort of ground school. Either you got the Jetson written course the books, or you got the Gold Seal online course. You should have gone through that before you got into the cross country phase of your training. The earlier you go through your ground training, the better it is for you in your training. So especially when so many people have time now because of the coronavirus, good time to get your ground training done. So go through those courses. Either of the courses, the Gold Seal or the Jepson, will fully teach you all the material that you should know via ground training. I also recommend that especially if you don't have the Gold Seal course, that you take either the Sporties or the King School online course, because those courses, sometimes it kind of goes through the material again and kind of helps you cement it. Once you're done with that, you should do practice tests. I usually do the ASA online questions because I like doing it online. I believe in your packet, you still get the Glide Red Book with all the questions on it there. I like doing it online, and I like doing it written. Either way is fine. Practice with that. If there's a Sporties practice test, that's perfectly fine to take that as well. You do the Glide practice test, the ASA practice test, it really doesn't matter. Those are all pretty much good ways to get ready. Once you're consistently scoring well, you can go in and take the written. Generally, people score a little bit lower on their writtens than on their practice tests because there's some questions that aren't in the books that are always worded differently. They keep on trying to stay ahead of the people stealing all the questions. So just, don't go if you're getting borderline scores. Another question that a lot of people ask is, does it make a difference what my score is on the written? 70 is passing, isn't that good enough? Okay. So my answer is you should endeavor to get a very good score on your written. I don't think getting a 70 is good enough unless you're struggling just to pass the course. And the reason why is on your practical test with the FAA examiner, he's legally required to ask you questions on every topic you get wrong on your written test. If you get 100%, then he doesn't have to ask you any questions about any topics you got wrong. If you got a 70% and you got wrong 22 topics, or whatever the number is, then he's going to ask you a bunch of questions about stuff that he may not want to ask you about. If you got wrong about aircraft stability, I promise you, no examiner is going to ask you about aircraft stability on a oral for a private. But if you got that wrong on the written, he has to ask you about it. So the better you do on the writtens, the quicker your oral is going to go, the easier your oral is going to go. Just to give you an example, and this is a kind of controversial topic for some people. Some people are like, oh, just pass the test. I really don't believe that. Try to do as well as you can. For my CFI exams, there's 3 of them. My writtens, I got 100, 198 because I studied my butt off. My oral for my CFI exam was 2 hours. Okay, it's the shortest oral of anyone I've ever heard for the CFI. Someone in my class with the same examiner got a 73, a 74, and a 75, and his oral was 8 hours long. So it's not going to be that extreme on a private, but examiners definitely ask a lot more questions to people who do worse on their written. So try to do as well as you can. If 73 or 75 is the best you can do, that's fine. Just study for your oral. That's the last thing I just want to talk to you about before I go is what's going to happen when you get to the end of the training. You are going to do a prop check with me, which is going to be a mock check rifle. It's going to be just like your check rifles. Your check ride has 2 portions, an oral exam and a flying portion. Everything that's going to be on your check ride is in the ACS. And you should have a copy of the ACS in your packets. You can download it from the FAA for free. Everything that they can ask you about is in the ACS. Every maneuver that you're going to do is in the ACS. So there should be no surprise about what happens on your check ride. Everything that's going to be on your check ride, you're going to be practicing in the air ahead of time. Any questions that we could ask is going to be straight out of the ACS guide. So make sure you look at that. Make sure you understand those topics. When it comes to the Prog 26, when you're with me, guess what I'm going to be looking straight at when I ask my questions, the ACS. So that's how you get prepared for the Prog 26. And the very last point is a lot of people are scared to fly with me because and do the Prog 26 because they heard that I have a reputation for being a hot ass. Not apologizing if that's true. All I'm doing is holding you to the standards of the ACS. So if you're doing that in your training and you feel confident in your ability to fly the way the ACS says you should, for the most part, you'll do just fine with me. One of these days, we're going to do a maneuver review online like this. So we're going to go through each of the maneuvers and we'll talk about what the expectations is to do each of those maneuvers. So if that's something you're interested, please drop an email to the front desk as well and let them know how you feel about that. And hopefully we could pull that together and maybe have some videos to show you as well. Thanks for joining me. It's kind of weird to talk into an empty room without feedback, so I hope it wasn't too awkward for you guys. And maybe we'll see you next time. Stay safe and hope to see you flying as soon as we all can. Bye-bye.